Hi people, this is called Throw Away the Lighter and Fan the Flame. Look out on YouTube in full, okay? Dee 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 da. Dee 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 da. Something moves me with passion. Something soothes me with love. Every time I see you, you're with another man. Is he your Mr. Big? If so, I don't give a frig. Dee 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 da da. Dee 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 da da. I'm burning up deep inside with passion I can't hide. When we were together, I was always inside. Dee 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 da da. Dee 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 da da. 'Twas like heaven without a bumpy ride. Now you've gone and left me, I'm feeling cold outside. How I miss those nights together, miss that lovely ride. Dee 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 da da. Dee 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 da da. I hope that you will throw away the lighter and fan the flame, 'cause my heart is written in your name. I miss the way you ride, so slippery like a snake. Miss your inner sanctum too, and how I feel inside you. Baby, give me all you got. Want you badly, hot, hot, hot. Throw away that useless man, 'cause he can't love you the way I can. Dee 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 da da. Dee 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 da da. Come back to me, you're my number one. Throw away the lighter and fan the flame. You got my heart written in your name. What you see in him, I don't know. But D, I told you so. He's no good, he's no good. He is rotten like a piece of wood. Just throw away the lighter and fan the flame. Stop me from burning up inside all over again. Dee 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 da da. Dee 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 da da.